of Kentucky College of Medicine. With over 3 decades of NIH-funded research experience, Dr. Spear has served as PI on multiple R01 and U-Series grants. His work has focused on liver development, cancer biology, and gene regulation, and he has a strong track record of mentoring junior investigators and undergraduate researchers in biomedical research. Dr. Spear brings a wealthy of insight into writing competitive R15 and R16 applications with a special emphasis on the unique institutional and student-focused aspect of this mechanism. Thank you, Dr. Spear, for coming here. Let me introduce Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a professor in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biochemistry and the leading researcher at the University of Kentucky's Sanders Brown Center on Aging. His research on Alzheimer's disease pathogenesis has been supported by continuous NIH funding, including R01 and R21 mechanisms. In addition to his research leadership, Dr. Murphy has extensive experience reviewing NIH grant applications and mentoring faculty in the successful development of R15 and R16 proposals. His guidance emphasizes scientific rigor, clarity of presentations, and alignment with the mission of AREA and REAP programs. Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Now the floor is yours, and we will have the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that great introduction. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, good. Nice nods. All right, let me go to share screen here. Okay. Hold on a second. It worked before. Let's try it one more time. All right, can you see it okay?
No, not now.
All right. What happened? It was working before. Let's see. Let's try. Wonder what it's done. We did test this.
We just now.
Hold on. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay, good. I don't know why it does that sometimes. I think no one knows why sometimes. They swear you do exactly the same thing, and sometimes it just doesn't work. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you a very simple overview of the basic components of how you put the aims and approach sections or research strategy section together as kind of a coherent whole while thinking about how this is going to be reviewed. So this is going to be a shortish presentation where, as Dr. Spear is going to bring up later, we have a longer, more in-depth 2-day workshop on how to put these things together, which will happen in a week and a half. So this is more focused on how this fits together into the new review framework, which I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. So what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to both cover the, get an understanding of what the general requirements are for both the specific aims page and the research strategy section. So those crucial 7 pages, which are the heart of your grant proposal. And then to learn how that research strategy section is meant to be kind of an expansion of that aims page and to fulfill kind of what you are promising the reviewers up front about what you're going to do in the questions you're going to try to answer. And then to understand how the reviewer expectations fit into this framework, especially since this is now, the new simplified review framework has just recently gone into play at CSR. And I've been through one whole study section with the new framework, and so I can answer questions on how this goes in practice. And I'm generally pretty positive about it, so I'll tell you that up front before we get to that. So a general sort of theme I'm going to touch on going through here a lot is that one of the key aspects of grant writing is that you really need to be clear, concise, and consistent throughout, and you have to make things easy for your reviewer. This always ties back to the whole consideration of, space is at a premium. The R16 mechanism is a short page length mechanism. Even R1s are quite short, but the R16 is very short. So with your aims and research strategy section only being a total of 7 pages, being clear and being consistent and being concise is super important. The other thing that I will come back to a couple of points is this thing I keep saying about making a good faith effort. And this is also tied into the page limitation. So reviewers know that you don't have a lot of space. So because you're only putting things in there that you know are important, you're often going to be leaving out a lot of extra details, which if you had unlimited space, you would put in. So we're really looking for, as a reviewer, that you've made a good faith effort to cover the key points, and you have to do a lot of kind of work on the implicit side of implying things that are not actually there. And we'll come back to this a couple of different times. So that specific aims page is a concise summary of the whole grant application. And the intended audience here for your aims page is the study section, is not the same audience as the abstract, right? The abstract can be thought of, I guess, a couple of different ways. The easiest way to think about it is almost like a lay summary of the aims page. But the abstract or the project summary is the public-facing component of your grant application. If it's funded, that would be what people see in NIH Reporter. So you don't want to have any proprietary information or details in there. It has to be very simple and explain the public health relevance of why you're doing this and what the project is about. But it's meant to be a very simple read, and it's not really what your study section is looking at. They are looking at this specific aims page first as the overall summary, right? For your 3 assigned reviewers, that page is actually also kind of their guide or roadmap as to what they're going to expect to find as they go through your research strategy, right? So this is what I mean about fulfilling promises to your reviewers when you put stuff up front here on your aims page. But also for the rest of your study section, for many of them, if not all or most of them, the other study section members are not going to read your grant. They're only going to be looking at this specific aims page, often only when it's being presented, summarized, and discussed by your 3 main reviewers. So they'll put that up to kind of help them pay attention and be their guide to how the reviewers are talking about this. So this is why that aims page, even though it's very compressed, you want to keep your jargon to a minimum, make it easy to follow and really clear, because a lot of people are going to be looking at this for the first time, and they want to be able to make sense of your whole project by just skimming through that page without thinking about it too much. And then if it looks interesting, they'll go through the rest of the grant as discussions are going on, look at the figures maybe. So it's like, look at the summary, then look at the pictures, right? But this is how a lot of people review in the context of study section, because I know many people are aware of this, but in case you're not, a grant is presented and discussed in about 15 minutes. So everything has to be really, really easy to follow. So there are a lot of different formats for the aims page. I'm just going to cover the most basic one that we typically teach as part of our grants workshop. And this is this 4-section or 4-paragraph structure. So at the beginning of your aims page, your first paragraph is typically kind of like your background and significance of the whole project. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Remember, when you're thinking about significance in terms of what it is that you're doing, it's never so much about something like cancer is a dangerous disease and we're working on cancer. By significance, it means that what is the specific question that you're trying to answer about this area, and how important is it to that field? So keep that in mind when you're thinking about significance. It's not the broad general area. All these diseases are important. It's the specific question that you're trying to answer. How important is that? How impactful would that be? Then your second paragraph is the rationale and feasibility paragraph. You're explaining to your reviewers why you were doing this, what led you to this point. Was it some data that you had that were really neat, or just really an idea that occurred to you while you were reading the literature? So why are you doing this project? What is the background specifically to this question? Or why do you want to work on this question? What is supporting this? Then what you want to also do in those first couple of paragraphs is to clearly state what your project hypotheses or goals are. Right. I often find in my writing that usually putting it somewhere near the end of that second paragraph is a really good place. The important thing is that it's easy to find for the reviewers so they know what your project is about in a really simple 1 or 2 sentences at most. So usually on my aims page, I will just underline or bold that part so they can find that when someone just looks at that page and see what's the hypothesis, and there it is right there, right? Now remember, your panel has broad expertise. They're all experts in the general area, but not maybe on your specific problem. So again, clarity, conciseness, and keep that jargon to a minimum, especially on that first page. You can expand on things later in more depth. Now, after those first 2 paragraphs, you're going to list your actual aims. For a R16, you might have 3 aims, but typically 1 or 2 is more common because it's a shorter project. But there's really no hard number. You can put whatever number of aims in there you think are useful. These are typically listed as standalone headers or bullet points, 1 to 3 sentences each. Be very strong with the verbiage that you're using. So things like quantify, identify, understand, elucidate, something that makes it clear what you're trying to do in the aim. Also include something about how you plan to interpret the data and describe the expected outcomes in a very simple, straightforward way. So the example I have here, I hypothesize that vascular pathology in XYZ mice requires ABC. If that's true, knocking out ABC should reduce vascular pathology, and we're going to assess this by, right? So you have to keep those as very, very straightforward, simple things. I think reviewers in general, I mean, I do occasionally see someone that will write an aim page where each aim is like a very large chunk of text. Those are harder for reviewers to follow, and I would strongly suggest you make them shorter and easier to digest. Then at the end of that, you're having an impact paragraph, which you're going to emphasize why the study is important, how it's going to have a sustained impact on your field or subfield, and where it might lead in the future. So remember, one of the goals of the R16 program is to build a sustainable research enterprise at your institution. So you want to show that this is going to lead somewhere in the future. Right. The research strategy section is that expansion of the aims page. So your aims page is just 1 page. You now have 6 pages to build out on that. So each of those sections or paragraphs on your aims page is going to be built out in that research strategy section with more detail. So you're going to open with a background and significance section, which is going to be typically for a 6-page grant is going to be 1 to 1.5 pages in length. And you can put preliminary data in there if you have it. I'll come back to this in a second about where you would go with your preliminary data if you have some. Now, on average, the approach component, which is generally thought of as the bulk of the research strategy section, that's going to be about 3/4 of the total length. So for an R16, it's going to be 4 to 4.5 pages. You're also going to have a student involvement plan, which is 1/4 to 1/2 page in length. And you should also, if you can, find about 1/4 to 1/2 page towards the end to cover that overall impact. So this is building out all of those things that you have on your aims page, right? Those 4 pieces, your background and significance in that first paragraph, then your feasibility, rationale, and approach, your aims, your student involvement, and then a final impact thing at the end. So you have this implicit promise to the reviewers that you've put up on that first page, right? And reviewers are going to expect to see all of these different things in your research strategy section. They're going to expect to see the who, what, why, where, and what of your research proposal. You're going to need to know why you're doing this, how you're going to carry it out, what might not work, what are the potential problems going to be, how long is it going to take? If you have space, I would always strongly recommend you put a timeline in. If you have a multi-year grant, reviewers often like to see when you're planning to do things. And where is it going to lead in the future? So they're going to expect to be able to find all of these things. And when I talk about how you make things easy for your reviewer, labeling things is really helpful. So having a section that's specifically labeled as data analysis, a section that's specifically labeled as potential problems or alternative approaches. So when your reviewers are looking for things, they can find them without having to struggle or do searches for things. Remember, you want to cover everything that's on the aims page. So if you have a strong statement about why something is important, make sure that you back it up with a good argument with references or data if you have it, right? Because reviewers will expect that. If you make an eyebrow-raising statement in your opening page, they say, oh, that's really interesting. And they're going to expect to see that argument expanded on in the research strategy. Now, data. Now, this comes up all the time. Do I need to have preliminary data? It is not required. So if you do not have data, it is not a criticism for someone to raise in review saying that there are no preliminary data. That's not a valid criticism. But if you present data, it is people can comment on it, right? Now, where you put your data is important. It really depends on what type of data it is. If you have a really strong, striking piece of data that led you to propose this project, really where it belongs is in that significance section, right? You want to show it up front because it is really exciting and interesting, and you want reviewers to see it early in the proposal. Reviewers are reading a lot of things. You don't want them to be bored, right? So you want to lead with something that shows that you have a cool idea. And you say, I have a really good idea to do this because of this really neat thing that I saw. And you show that on the first or second page of your grant proposal, right? Now, if the data are more like, your idea was based on, I've read the stuff in literature and I have some background in this area, and really your data speaks more to things like feasibility, showing that you can do this sort of work, then it would appear further down, like in the approach section, showing that I'm capable of doing this type of experiment. So where you put the data really depends on those two things. Is it driving the idea, or is it just showing that it's feasible? Now, also, when you put methods in your proposal, I've experimented with putting methods in different places. Generally speaking, when you put your methods early in your proposal, it tends to make reading it a slog, and your reviewers can struggle with it. So I would strongly recommend that you put it further along. Some reviewers are really methods driven and they like to be able to find these things. So it's nice to put them in a place where they can be located. But also it's good to actually have the reviewers get through the interesting or exciting idea part of the grant and the data and the feasibility and the experiments themselves, rather than drilling through the details of how you're going to do stuff early on, because that tends to have things get bogged down. Now, when you're putting preliminary data in, what is really important is that you have to be able to explain how the data is connected to the proposal. Is it feasibility? Is it showing that this proposal is the next logical step to do in this field? Is it supporting your hypothesis? Is it showing likelihood for success, right? So what is the data for, right? What is it supporting in your actual project? You want to be able to have a clearly articulatable reason for what the data is doing in your proposal, right? It has to have a purpose. So the quality of that data also speaks to how good you are as a researcher. So when you're thinking about putting data in, make sure that not only the data does serve a purpose in the proposal, but that it reflects on the type of work that you're going to do and how good a job you do. So if the data don't look great, if they look kind of really variable, or they look like the experiment is not well designed, or it's missing things, that's going to reflect poorly on you on terms of feasibility and rigor, because one of the things reviewers are going to comment on is rigor and reproducibility. And if your data that you put in there don't look like a good data set, they'll wonder if you can actually do good experiments. So keep that in mind, that the data you're presenting have to look nice. It has to be really good. Now, when you're talking about your experiments and methods, that how part, your experiments have to serve a purpose, obviously. But the hardest part about presenting experiments within a short space is that you don't have a lot of room for detail. You want to make this good faith effort to provide sufficient detail so that reviewers know that you understand what you're doing, that you know what the key factors are of that type of experiment, and that you can effectively carry out the research. So if it's a very routine thing, like you're doing some histology, which is a very well understood histological technique, you just say that we are doing this, give some references, and then talk about some key aspect of it, say how you are sampling your data or how you're preparing the tissue or something like that. It shows you understand the important variables in that procedure. And you want to only use descriptive details to show that you understand how you do this sort of thing. And reviewers know that you're not able to cover absolutely everything. And I often think about this iceberg model, right? When you're talking about data analysis and experimental design, you can only tell the reviewers a little bit of information about what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it. And you have to imply all of this other stuff that's under the surface about things that you know, or you should know how to do. If you know how to do A, you then know how to do B, C, D, E, and F. And some of the other things you really need to hit on when you're thinking about this is you need to think about some aspects of experimental design that reviewers really, really like to find. So you need to absolutely cover somewhere what happens if your experiment doesn't work the way you plan. So it's both important to critically and clearly state what you think is going to happen. Never assume that your reviewers are going to automatically understand why you're doing this experiment or what one particular outcome might mean. And always give a backup plan for key experiments. What are you going to do if this doesn't work, right? So what are your alternatives and how are you going to approach these? And again, good faith effort. You can't cover everything that's possible, but you do want to be able to touch on some likely alternatives. And be sure to tie your biosketch directly into that approach section so that it can see your particular expertise, that you can explain how you know how to do these things, especially if you only have a few publications in an area, right? You want to be able to make sure that you say that this paper shows that you know how to do X, this publication shows you know how to do Y, and so on, right? Remember that good faith effort. And for stuff that you can't explicitly show, remember, provide references, talk in that facility section about institutional resources in addition to your own documented expertise, as well as the expertise of your collaborators and your consultants. All right, that's your whole overall compressed version of how you put a grant proposal together in this format and key aspects to think about. I wanted to touch a little bit on review before we pass it over to Brett to talk about the R15 and R16 program. So, I mean, a lot of people are going to have questions about the new review process. So the reason why NIH changed the review process from the 5 criteria to 3 was that there was an impression that the review criteria was a bit much. And this has been going on for some years now, that there were a lot of aspects of the proposals that viewers felt were not really helpful to review. I actually think they didn't go far enough in cutting some of this out. We'll come back to that later if we have time. So they wanted to reduce the administrative burden on aspects of the proposal that reviewers were going to look at. So they wanted reviewers to focus on the science of the proposal and not the aspects of it that don't matter so much. Because they're trying to get your feedback as a scientist on why you think this work is important and can it be done, right? They also felt, I think this point is actually more important, that a lot of smaller institutions felt, and for very good reason, that there was an unfair reputational bias that was influencing NIH peer review. So this can very simply be summarized that investigators from historically very well-funded and very well-established famous institutions were often getting a pass on things that would get more scrutiny at smaller institutions, and the same would go for their own personal reputation in the field. So a very famous researcher at a Ivy League school would get a pass on leaving out details in a proposal where that would not be allowed for someone who was at a smaller school who was not as well established. And there was good reason to believe that. So they wanted to try to get rid of this institutional bias. So what was changed was that they took those 5 review criteria they originally had and they reorganized them into 3 factors. So the same review criteria are still there. They've just been moved into 3 different factor categories rather than the 5 of significance, innovation, approach, PI, and environment. Now it's 3 factors instead. So the investigator and environment are now evaluated as either sufficient or gaps identified. So there's no longer a score for that. This is considered in the overall score, but not given an individual score. And I'll come back to that in a second. And a lot of the additional review criteria, although some of them stay in factor 2, so things like how you describe human subjects and vertebrate animals and so on, that stays as a component of factor 2, but doesn't get an individual score. And then other things like resource sharing, select agents, those are now handled by NIH staff and they're no longer in the actual review process. They're reviewed separately on an administrative level. So the easy way to think about this is the 3 factors are, should it be done? Can it be done well? And is the expertise and resources around to do this? So this is a very simple thing, right? Only factors 1 and 2 are getting an individual score, 1 to 9, the same as NIH scoring system has been for some years now. So 1 is your best possible score, and 9 is the worst, and 5 is the average, right? Factor 1, the importance of the research, combines significance and innovation into 1 score. And factor 2, the rigor and feasibility, is now the approach. And then environment and investigator in that factor 3. Now, should it be done? What you're thinking of here is that you're trying to, when the reviewers are looking at your proposal, they're looking at how important it is. Is this really an interesting question? Is it addressing a major gap in the field, right? So have you provided a good rationale for the proposed study? Does it follow from the literature or your data? And if you answered this, would it make a big difference, right? Would it actually have a sustained and lasting impact in the field? The innovation criteria is now rolled into this section where when you're thinking about innovation, it's really kind of something that can supplement the significance, but it's no longer a driving factor on its own. So in other words, if you have a really fascinating and amazing and interesting methodology, on its own, it's no longer a separate criteria. The question itself that you're using that method to answer has to be really interesting, right? It's more the innovation aspect now is more thought of as conceptual innovation for the most part in terms of significance. Now, in that can it be done well factor, you are they're assessing the approach. So how you are putting your experiments together. Do they look like they're rigorously designed? That's going to, your results are going to be reproducible. Have you adequately considered human subjects, inclusion criteria, vertebrate animals, biohazards? Is your work feasible? Do you have enough time to do these experiments? Are the resources there to be able to do the experiments in that time, right? What sort of alternative approaches have you considered? So this is just the whole approach section evaluated in this context, right? Again, a 1 to 9 score. Now that third factor, expertise and resources, this is environment and investigator combined. So here what you're looking at is something much more focused than what they've done in the past. And I think this actually has worked pretty well, at least in the first round of review. So what you're doing is when you're reviewing the qualifications of the PI and the environment, you're looking to see if it is adequate, if there are sufficient expertise and resources to do the studies proposed. If it looks like that is there, and you click the box that says appropriate, there is no longer any option to comment. So it's just appropriate or not. And if you say that it's not appropriate or gaps are identified, you have to specifically state what is missing. So if you say that factor 3 is not appropriate or there are gaps identified, it has to be a very specific thing that is not there. So for example, if someone was proposing to do a human subjects experiment and they had never done any human subjects related research before, you would click that it's not sufficient. It's that the PI does not have any expertise in running human subject studies, and they need at the very minimum a collaborator to help with this. So it has to be a very specific thing that is missing that you can then identify, right? So there are no comments permitted if it's listed as acceptable. And why that's important is because now it's a case of if someone has only 1 or 2 papers in an area, and they're working on a method that they have documented expertise in, their expertise is now sufficient. So there's nothing to go on top of that to say that, oh, this person only has a few papers or so on. You can't then say that, oh, this person has 500 papers, they're amazing, they don't need to tell me anything. So that's meant to eliminate that reputational bias aspect of grant review. Now, one of the things that for R16s that we'll come back to in our longer thing in a couple of weeks is that student involvement plan, which is actually quite short. It's typically we recommend maybe a quarter to a half page, but student involvement is really important in all 3 factors of review here. You'll notice I highlighted the word student and where it comes up. You have to actually cover all of these aspects of how you involve students in research, what sort of experience they're going to get, how you're going to find the students they're going to work in your lab. Are you going to identify them through coursework? How are you going to meet them? How are you going to interview them? What are they going to get out of it? Are they going to get to go to conferences? Are they going to get publications? All of that stuff is really important for this program. And it's the same for R15s as well. R15 has a similar component. right? So keep that in mind. You have a very limited amount of space to talk about student involvement, and you have to use it well. Now, how this fits together, and then I'm going to pass it over to Brett. One of the things that people misunderstand about grant review is that the overall impact is not the average of the different factors. And this is especially true now that we only have 2 factors. So factor 1, your significance score, or that, should it be done score, right? This is your best possible score if everything in your proposal worked out exactly as planned, right? So this is the best you can possibly do. Factor 2 is how good your proposal is at addressing the questions that you raised, the thing that you're trying to answer. How good will your experiments be at answering that question? So that means that even if your overall impact score cannot be better than your factor 1 score, right? And this is because even if you're doing really great experiments, if your question isn't interesting, it doesn't matter how well you answer it, right? So if you have a score of 4 for significance and a 1 for your factor 2 score for your approach, then your score is going to be a 4, right? Because even if everything else is awesome, you can't do better than 4. Right. So the other way to think about this is that the weaknesses there are going to pull your overall score down. It's not going to be the average of the 2. It depends how the reviewer weights this thing. And by a similar token, factor 3 is not going to improve your overall score. It can only weaken it, right? Because it doesn't add to it. It can only subtract. So if gaps are identified, it can pull your overall score down away from that maximum significance score. Keep that in mind. That's a really hard thing for a lot of people to grasp. And 5 is really what you think of as the average score. Right, we're supposed to start as reviewers at a score of 5 and then deviate from that depending on whether there are more weaknesses or more strengths. Okay, last thing, remember that research productivity is only a specific criteria for renewals, but it also does speak to factor 2. So this is like how many papers you would have, right, on a specific topic. So because it can speak to factor 2 in terms of feasibility, it's a little bit squishy. So how it's weighted is left up to the discretion of each reviewer. When you're writing a grant, remember to use white space to your advantage. Big blocks of uninterrupted text are really hard to read and tiring for reviewers. Remember to use emphasis sparingly. It loses effectiveness if you over italicize, over bold, or over underline, then reviewers can't see what you think is important because everything looks important. And last thing is, remember that having a well-written grant proposal, although it's not score driving, and reviewers are always told that this is not a scoreable factor, how well something is written. But reviewers will consider something that's put together in a messy or sloppy way as a proxy for someone who does sloppy research. So keep that in mind and always remember to proofread carefully. That's cool. Now I will pass it on to Dr. Spear, who's going to talk a little bit about the R15 and R16 program.
All right, thanks, Paul. Okay, so I'm gonna get mine up here. All right, I think it looks good. Well, first of all, thanks to Hong Mei for inviting us to meet with you today. We're really excited about the opportunity, and thank you for spending part of your day to join us as well. So we're going to change gears a little bit, but some of the things that Paul talked about, I'll touch upon as well. But my goal over the next 20, 30 minutes or so is severalfold. First of all, really to talk about the R16 and R15 funding mechanisms themselves, to talk a little bit about what the goals of these funding mechanisms are, and compare and contrast, because there are some similarities between both of these mechanisms, but there's some really important distinctions as well. So you really want to explore these options to decide which is the best mechanism for whatever your research might be. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about our Sure Resource Center, the kinds of services and resources that we provide, and things that hopefully you'll consider as you're preparing your grants and getting your research going to hopefully help you in a variety of different ways. So what's common between these two programs? And there's really 3 things I think that really are shared, but three components of these grants that are really shared. First of them, and this is probably the most important thing, these are R-series grants from NIH, which means they're research grants. So these grants have to support meritorious research. And the goal of NIH is to improve the health of our nation. And your research doesn't have to be directly health related. certainly, if you're doing something that is very directly health related, whether it's community medicine or human subjects research, that's one thing. But fundamental basic research, as we know, really drives a lot of the healthcare in this country. Experiments that were done in bacteria, other types of experimental organisms have worked their way into the healthcare system. So if you're really doing good, solid research that's addressing a really fundamental biological or biochemical genetic problem, that's important, and that's the kind of research that NIH is interested in. But the research really has to be meritorious. Secondly, the second goal is to strengthen the research environment in institutions that in general don't have a substantial amount of NIH funding. Paul touched upon already the fact that they've changed the review criteria at NIH so that some of the real premier institutions don't get a free pass in certain ways. NIH understands that there's great faculty at institutions, all types of institutions around the country. There's outstanding students at all types of institutions, and NIH wants those institutions to participate in biomedical research. And third, is that the goal of both of these programs is to provide students with a meaningful research experience, not just working in or being in a lab, washing glassware, helping do basic things, but to really have a meaningful research experience, hopefully so that they'll pursue careers in some area of biomedical behavioral research down the road. So all these things are important. And so you really should think about these as you're considering different options and what you're trying to do. Now, R15 grants, just to touch upon these for a second, there's really 4 types of R15 grants. There's 2 types of grants called area grants, and these types of grants are for undergraduate focused institutions, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here, but basically these are situations where the undergraduate enrollment is greater than the graduate enrollment, so schools that may have both graduate programs and undergraduate programs, but primarily focus on undergraduates. These types of institutions qualify for area grants. And there's 2 sort of flavors of these. One is where clinical trials are not allowed, and the other is where clinical trials are allowed. And there's different requirements for these types of grants. And I've listed the NOFOs, or Notice of Funding Opportunities, for these types of grants here, the PAR 25, 134, and 148. If you look these up on NIH, you'll learn more about these types of grants. And then the other type of R15 grants are called REAP grants, and these are Research Enhancement Award Programs. These are for schools that are more focused on health professionals or graduate schools. So more of a graduate enrollment or health professional school. And once again, you can have ones where the clinical trial is not allowed or the clinical trial is required. And keep in mind, even if in situations where a clinical trial is not allowed, you can still do human subjects research. It just isn't necessarily a clinical trial. And there's very defined definitions for what is or what is not a clinical trial. And the last one, the REAP grant, where the clinical trial is required, that actually is not an active grant program at the moment. There's been a lot of changes at NIH over the last couple of years. Some programs have been terminated and then they've been republished. And actually the REAP grant program with the clinical trial being required is currently not active. Now, if you look at some of the information from NIH, it looks like they're in the process of getting this particular NOFO republished. Hopefully it'll be sometime this fall. So I think this will be back in line soon, but again, there's been a lot of changes at NIH, and this is one where we're just going to have to wait a little while for this program to reemerge. R16 grants, on the other hand, there's 2 types of R16 grants. There's the SURE grant, and these are for generally for faculty who've had some research experience, that have had some funding experience. And then there's the SURE First, which is for faculty, generally new faculty, but not necessarily, but specifically for faculty who have not previously had their own independent research grant as a PI. And I'll go into some of the more nuanced differences between these 2 types of mechanisms in a few minutes. One thing I do want to mention about SURE First is that it's a mentored award, so that faculty who are going to be submitting a SURE First grant have to identify a US-based scientist who can serve as a mentor. And this is a person that has some experience with the type of research you're doing, hopefully has some type of experience with NIH, so that they can help mentor you and make sure that you're doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing to really develop your NIH-focused research program. And I'd like to sort of compare and contrast the R15 and the R16 mechanisms a little bit. So one of them is institutional eligibility. Okay, so for the R15 grants, for both the area and the REAP grants, the institution has to have less than $6 million per year of total NIH support in 4 of the last 7 fiscal years. Now, certain types of NIH funding mechanisms like the CO6 grant, the S10 equipment grant, and certain what are called G-type grants are not included in these calculations. Don't ask me why they came up with this determination of 4 of the last 7 fiscal years, but that's what it is. So the institutions have to look at their NIH support over this period of time and determine whether or not they're eligible. And as I said earlier, with the area grant, undergraduate enrollment is greater than graduate, and then the REAP grants for health professional and graduate schools. R16 grants, similar but not exactly the same. So for the R16 funding mechanism to determine eligibility, the institution has to have less than $6 million specifically in NIH research project grants or R-series grants. And at least 25% of the student body has to be supported by Pell Grants in each of the 2 preceding fiscal years. So similarities, but some differences between the 2 types of funding mechanisms in terms of eligibility. Sometimes it's a little complicated, particularly for determining Pell eligibility. If you have any questions about whether or not your institute is eligible and you can't quite figure it out, you're welcome to contact us with our Sure Resource Center, and we'll help you figure that out if necessary. So what about the PI? So there's a couple of, again, similarities and differences between the 2 mechanisms. So for the R15 mechanism, you have something called a multi-PI format being allowed. So a multi-PI is where you have 2 or possibly 3 different faculty members or 2 or 3 different investigators can actually share the PI role for that grant. Okay, all of the PIs have to be eligible for the R15 mechanism to be considered as a multi-PI format. So anyway, that's allowable. In contrast, for the R16 grants, the multi-PI format is not allowed. You can only have a single PI or principal investigator for the R16 mechanism. However, there are other types of investigators that can play a role in a grant. NIH grants can have co-investigators, okay? And sometimes you might have consultants, and co-investigators and consultants are both allowed on the R15 and R16 grants. I know, well, sometimes people get a little confused about the terminology. Sometimes people use the term co-PI. NIH does not use the term co-PI. In a grant, an investigator on a grant is either a PI, the principal investigator, a co-investigator, or a consultant. Okay, so again, that's a little difference in terms of the multi-PI format. For the R15 mechanism, the PI must have no active NIH RPG or research project grants at the time of the award, okay, when the award is made. And the amount of effort that the PI wants to put into the grant is determined by the PI. However much effort he or she feels is necessary to successfully achieve the goals of the grant, whether it's 10% of their effort, 20%, 1 or 2 calendar months, 3 calendar months, whatever you feel is necessary, that's the amount of effort that you put into the grant. And your effort, of course, can be supported by the grant. Little different with the R16s, okay? So again, in terms of eligibility for the Sure First, I mentioned this is for faculty who have not had previous experience as being PI of an externally funded peer-reviewed grant. And again, whether it's a federal grant or a non-federal grant, if they have been PI of a grant that's been funded and peer-reviewed, then they're not eligible for Sure First, okay? Now for the Sure grant, the PI must have no active NIH funding. They might have funding from another institution. They may have funding from a private entity, but if the faculty member does not currently have any NIH funding as a research grant, okay, then they're eligible for the Sure grant, okay? Now, I'll talk a little bit more about reapplying, but if a faculty member has a Sure grant in the last year of their funding, whether it's a SURE or SURE First, they can transition into a SURE grant. So SURE grants can be maintained over several funding cycles, multiple funding cycles, okay? Now, in terms of the percent effort, this is one thing that's quite different between SURE and SURE First, as well as the R15s. So for a SURE First mechanism, the PI must commit 50% of their effort, which is 6 calendar months. This is a lot of effort, especially if you're doing a lot of teaching. They have to commit that effort to the grant itself. Now, for the SURE grant, the PI can determine how much effort they need, just like they do with the R15 grant. So SURE First, the amount of effort that is necessary is a heavy lift. It's 50%. We talked to a lot of faculty, even if they're eligible for the SURE First, they can't commit 50% of their effort to the grant. And in those cases, those faculty can simply submit a SURE grant. Okay, so even if you're eligible for SURE First, but you can't commit, you can submit a SURE grant. Available funding. So for the R15 grants, you can request up to $375,000 in direct cost over a 3-year period of the grant, and R15 grants can be renewed. R16 grants, the SURE First, you can request up to $125,000 per year for up to 4 years. With a SURE grant, up to $100,000 in direct costs per year for up to 4 years. And as I mentioned a minute ago, SURE grants can be renewed. SURE First grants cannot be renewed. They're sort of a one-time thing, but if after getting the SURE First grant, at the end of that funding cycle, you can transition to a SURE grant. Okay, and then some other considerations to think about comparing and contrasting these two mechanisms. One of the important things I touched upon already is that clinical trials are allowed for both REAP and area grants. Clinical trials are not allowed for R16 grants. So if you're doing clinical trials, then the R15 mechanism is going to be the best mechanism for you. R15s have 3 deadlines every year, February, June, and October. In contrast, R16 have 2 deadlines, the end of May and the end of September every year. What about the review of the grants? And historically, the review of R15 and R16 grants have been a little different. Now, NIH is changing up, excuse me. NIH is changing the way they're reviewing grants right now. Sorry about that. NIH is changing the way they're reviewing grants. So going forward, I don't know how this is going to play out. But historically, R15 grants were reviewed either by special emphasis panels or by standing study sections, and they were pooled with other types of R-series grants. So R15s might be reviewed alongside R01 grants or R21 grants, those types of grants. Sorry about that. In contrast, R16 grants were reviewed by special emphasis panels that only reviewed R16 grants. Just a second. Oh. It never happened before. I'm really sorry. Okay, let's try this again. So our 15 grants were reviewed in combination with other types of grants. So reviewers had to sort of move between R01 grants, which are much larger, R21 grants, R15 grants, which I think is challenging. I've been on review panels that have reviewed all 3 types of grants, and it's difficult to review these types of grants. R16 grants are always reviewed in panels that only looked at R16 grants. And I think that made the review a little easier, a little bit more manageable, and a little more fair to the R16 grant mechanism. Like I said, I don't know how this is going to play out going forward because the review mechanisms at NIH are changing right now. R15 grants have a 12-page research strategy, 1-page specific aims. In contrast, R16 grants, the research strategy is only 6 pages. In both situations, preliminary data is not required, but it is allowed. Paul talked about this already. It's, sometimes preliminary data can really be valuable. So I really strongly encourage you to have preliminary data. If nothing else, it shows feasibility. But if you are putting data into your grant, it's going to be critiqued. So make sure that your data is good data. What about the success rate of the two programs? R15 grants in the past were funded by different institutes that participated in the program, and the success rate varied quite a bit between institutes. In contrast, the R16 grants in the past, a majority of the grants were actually funded by NIGMS. And in the first couple of years of the program, the success rate was quite high, about 40 to 50%. Now, NIAID also, that was the one institute that they reviewed the R16 grants themselves, and their success rate was a bit lower. But in general, the success rate for R16 grants was quite high, considerably higher than the R15 grants. As I mentioned already, there's a lot of changes going on at NIH, both in terms of, what's the budget going to be like? How are the grants going to be reviewed going forward? So I don't know how this is going to play out going forward. We're just going to have to wait and see. And finally, the last thing I'll mention is that with the R15 grants, NIH will provide support, and we always encourage people to contact people at NIH if they have questions about their grant. If you look at the notice of awards for the R15 grants, at the bottom of the award notice, they always have a list of people who you can contact. These are the program officers for the different programs. We always encourage you to contact program officers if you have any types of questions, or whether it's, is my research aligned with the institute? Is it aligned with what NIH wants? So on and so forth. With the R16 program, there is a resource center. And so we're going to transition to that real quick. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our resource center. So Paul and I are the co-directors of our University of Kentucky SURE Resource Center. So when NIH set up the SURE program about 5 years ago now, they decided to fund a single entity that was going to sort of provide services through a resource center to R16 eligible institutions and faculty at these institutions. And Paul and I submitted a grant, and we were awarded the grant. So we are the SURE Resource Center, and we have an outstanding group of faculty and staff and administrators here at the University of Kentucky that participate in the program. You can see them here, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. But our goal is to really help faculty and institutions that are interested and eligible with the SURE R16 funding mechanism, and to do everything that we can to help faculty and institutions participate in NIH funded research through R16 grants. And we have a website. I've listed our website here at the bottom. So if you want to know more about our center, I encourage you to take a look. This is a lot of the things that we do are shown in our center here. So we provide support in 4 different ways. We provide support through outreach and training, through consultation, our seed grant program, and then a biennial conference. And I'll touch upon all these very briefly. I'll focus a little bit more on the first 2. So what about outreach and training? So pretty much our training is all through Zoom webinars. It's all virtual. So we offer 2 types of trainings. First of all, we offer grantsmanship boot camps, and we normally do these about 6 to 8 weeks prior to each R16 deadline. The next R16 deadline is coming up at the end of September. And actually, we're going to have a 2-day boot camp, I guess about a week and a half from now, July 21st and 22nd of this year. These will be 1 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. This 2-day event, or 2-afternoon event, will really dig into some of the different aspects of putting your grant together. The first day really focuses on the scientific content of the grant. So some of the stuff Paul talked about earlier we'll expand upon during the boot camp, and then the second day we'll talk about some of the other documents that are necessary for R16 grants. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A with this. It's tomorrow at some point. I'll actually get the registration form up for this mechanism, so we'll have that. And then also we have a number of standalone sessions where we have webinars on a variety of topics. That some of them are focused more towards faculty, some are focused more towards staff, Office of Sponsored Project staff, so on and so forth. Some are for the trainees. We try to cover topics that could be of interest to everybody at SURE eligible institutions. So our next one actually is coming up next Wednesday on July 16th, 3 to 4 Eastern time. It's going to be an overview of the updated R16 NOFO. Actually, in middle of June, NIH published new NOFOs for the R16 program. So Paul and I are going to lead that discussion and talk about what are some of the updates. And so people are preparing, who are preparing grants for the September deadline will have that information. We normally, especially through the calendar year, we like to have 1 or 2 webinars every month. All of these webinars are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel so that they can be viewed at any time. Consultation is another big thing that we do. So our personnel are available for one-on-one consultation with faculty. So any types of questions you might have about the R16 grants, you can contact us and we'll do everything we can to answer your questions. We will critique your specific aims page of your grant. As Paul mentioned, the aims page is such an important part of a grant application. So if you reach out to us, usually we need some lead time, of course, at least 4 weeks, preferably a little bit more time in advance of a deadline. Send us your specific aims page. We have the scientific expertise to critique that aims page and give you some suggestions to make sure it's really strong. We don't really have the bandwidth to look at the entire research strategy, but we can work on the aims page with you. And you can email us at our SURE Resource Center at uky.edu, or you can contact a regional coordinator. So there's different ways that you can contact us. These are the people that are involved with the consultation. On the left side, you can see the faculty who are involved. We have a wide range of faculty who have had a lot of experience with NIH. Our NIH-funded investigators have expertise everywhere from neuroscience and aging and microbiology and immunology, behavioral science, community medicine, you name it. We have faculty who have a breadth of expertise. So we'll find a faculty member who's aligned with what research you're doing and have that person help you with the aims page. And we also have a number of people who are in research development. We have people from our proposal development office. They don't have the scientific expertise necessarily, but they certainly have a lot of experience with sort of putting together strong grant applications to make sure they're written well. And then we have other types of other administrative expertise in terms of budget, Office of Research Integrity, so on and so forth, to provide input with your grant applications. We have regional coordinators that sort of span the country. And again, I've just showed our regional coordinators here and the regions that they cover. So in Texas, Esther would be the regional coordinator for your area. And another way to get in touch with us is just to reach out to a regional coordinator, and if they can help you, they will. And if they not, they'll get you in touch with somebody in our group that can help you. Just very briefly before I open up for Q&A, we do have an OSP seed grant program, and this is a very innovative aspect of our program. So when we got our resource center, or when our resource center was funded by NIH, we were given $250,000 that we had to use each year to provide support for R16 eligibility to strengthen the research infrastructure at that institution. And really this is through, helping to strengthen their Office of Sponsored Projects, types of mechanisms that really help the entire institution, faculty at the entire institution. So we generally give out 5 or 6 of these every year, maximum of $50,000 each. These aren't funding for faculty. These are not like to fund scientific projects. They're to help the research infrastructure at the institution. So this has been a big part of what we do. And then finally, we also have a biennial conference. Our first biennial conference was in July of 2024. This was on the NIH campus. It turned out to be a lot of work, certainly to get it up and running. However, it turned out to be really an exciting event. We had some great keynote speakers that were in attendance. We ended up having about 250 people, including faculty, about 100 faculty, about 100 students, a lot of administrative staff, a lot of different workshops, a lot of people. We had students gave a lot of talks. We had a poster session. It was just turned out to be a really positive event. So that really went well, and our next one's going to be in 2027. It was supposed to be 2026, but NIH asked us to move it back a year. So that's something coming up down the road. So that's just a real brief overview of our resource center. We have webinars about our resource center too. So if you want to sort of look a little bit more about the things that we do, you can look at our YouTube channel and find out more about us. And finally, if you do go to our resource center, we have a stay informed button on our center where you can simply very quickly, if you give us your email, your name, your institution, and sort of what your capacity, whether you're a faculty or administrator or whatever, we'll send you updates through our listserv about anything that we're doing, the webinars that are coming up, boot camps, things that come down from NIH that we want to share with people. So we don't try to overwhelm you with emails, but anything that's important and relevant to NIH and the R16 program, we'll share. And with that, I'll wrap up, and I think we'll have some time for Paul and I to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spear and Dr. Murphy's wonderful presentation. Super helpful for our TSU faculty, and TSU is qualified for both R15 and R16. So we strongly encourage our faculty to apply and use our Sure Resource Center. I posted all the links in the chat section. You can go there and register the email list and stay informed. And we will also send you our TSU faculty emails if we receive any information from Sure Resource Center.
Right.
Also, I post the YouTube channels there and in the chat section. So we are open for Q&A section. You can raise your hand if you have any questions, or put in the Q&A section.
Yeah,
Okay,
there was one question, but I think it's already been answered. There was one question about R15 and R16 NIH grant timeline, funding, and eligibility by Dr. Attia, but I believe it has been answered by Dr. Spear's presentation.
Right.
And another question was, will the PowerPoint presentation be shared? I answered, we will record the webinar and make it available, but we will not share the presentation slides.
I
Yeah,
do have.
I was going to say, we talked earlier, the fact, things change a lot at NIH, and what might be true today might differ a week or a month from now. So it's important to keep that in mind.
I do have one question. For both, PI must have no active NIH research project grants at the time of award. How do we define at the time of award?
So there are a couple of ways that I'll answer one, and Brett, you can add to this. A lot of that is mainly going to, if you, for example, were in the last year of an R15 or the last year of a Sure First or something like that, you could apply for another one, or not another Sure First, but another Sure grant, right? So you could currently have some funding, but it is going to expire before the next award would start.
Right. So really even if you get an award, a notice that your grant is going to be funding, the grant officially starts when your institution gets the notice of award. And so that's really when things start. And you can sometimes negotiate, even though like you get a notice and it's, the grant can start on, say, December 1st. If for some reason you want to delay that for a little bit of time, you can contact your program officer and maybe negotiate if you want to start at a different time. But starting usually is when the notice of award comes to the institution. That's sort of when the grant starts.
Thank you. Oh, yes. We do have some more questions.
I know just to maybe touch upon one thing, a number of questions that we get People ask us a lot about co-investigators. You know, is it good to have a co-investigator? Is it not good to have a co-investigator? And I think co-investigators can really be valuable, provide valuable contributions to a grant, especially, you know, if let's say that your institution doesn't have a piece of equipment that's really necessary for you to carry out your work, but there's another institution, you know, maybe something in Houston, you know, the institution that's close by, but not necessarily, you know, that has some expertise or has some equipment or something that can really make a difference in the success of your project. You know, I really we encourage people to consider having co-investigators to really make sure that the project is as strong as possible. Having said that, it's also important to keep in mind that, you know, these R15 and R16 grants are really grants to strengthen the research infrastructure. So, you know, if you get submit an R15 grant, you know, you want $375,000, it's important that as much of that money go to your institution as possible. You don't want half of the money going to some other institution, because that doesn't necessarily help your infrastructure. So co-investigators can really be valuable for grants, but just be a little careful about sort of where the money goes when you're considering these types of things.
Thank you. We have one question in the Q&A. I previously identified a NOFO that is no longer available. What strategy would you recommend for finding a similar opportunity that aligns with my proposed idea?
Well, there's a couple of things that you can subscribe. Grants.gov does have information, and you can subscribe to updates, especially from NIH, if you want to sort of look at for things that are coming out. And NIH does publish on a weekly basis sort of updates about different types of funding opportunities. So I would subscribe to those types of things from NIH. And then the other thing, if you, depending on your area of research, if you look at the NIH website, there's 27 different institutes or centers at NIH. A majority of these, not all of them, but a majority of them actually do fund extramural research. And if you go into the NIH website and you look up the information about the different institutes, whether it's, say, the Cancer Institute, aging, so on and so forth, you can learn about the different institutes and what their priorities are. And again, they'll have contact information for people that you from these different institutes, and so you can email to these people to try to get some information about, you know, what you're doing, and if your research aligns with that institute, and if so, what types of different mechanisms that institute has that might be most relevant for your research. So I think it's worthwhile to sort of explore NIH to identify some contacts and reach out. Having said that, I know we talk to a lot of people these days that they say, you know, I reached out to NIH and no one responded to me. That's a real problem these days. I think people at NIH are really overwhelmed right now. There's a lot of changes taking place. The demands on the people at NIH has gone up a lot. The number of people at NIH has gone down a lot. So the people that are there is, you know, their work burden is increased a lot. So, you know, you might have to be a little persistent and patient when in trying to contact people at NIH, but that's really the best way to go. Paul, anything else to add?
Also a lot of times, even if they are aware of a funding opportunity or an RFA or something that's going to be upcoming, they're very limited in what they can tell you until something is official. So sometimes they can tell you something off the record and sometimes they can't. So you just need to be patient. Sometimes you can find things, if you look at the individual, it requires a little bit of digging, but the advisory councils for the different institutions, they'll publish long in advance of when they're going to have a notice of funding opportunity, things like research concepts and ideas that they're interested in and exploring in the future. And those typically are like precursors that then lead to notice of funding opportunities down the road, but they can't promise anything until it's actually published. So because sometimes I know in my field in aging, NIA publishes the concepts that they're interested in. So they'll say, oh, we're interested in, how you use AI to, integrate large data sets and aging populations. And there may not be a specific NOFO for that yet, but when they do that, they usually will, sometime in the next year, something will come out. So sometimes they can tell you some things about that, and sometimes not. So you have to do a little bit of digging.
Contact the program officer in NIH is a really great idea. So they may help us a lot to find new grants or opportunities, or suggest some new concept that for the future projects. I personally met one program officer actually suggested me for the future project by sending me some concept. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's almost exactly what I'm talking about. Like they can say, oh yeah, there's some stuff that might be coming. So they can be. And I will also say with I've had several times where I've contacted a program officer about something and I wasn't sure what to do with it, where they have been able to, with a very short email, connect me with somebody else that even though it had not occurred to me that this other person would be interested, that it did fit into an area that they could fit into another NOFO that it didn't look like was applicable for mine. But they said, oh, they were interested in that because it is related to this, right? It didn't get funded, but I mean, at least they said they were interested in it if it got a good score. So that is sometimes helpful.
I just put into the chat a link to the listserv for NIH, and you can sort of set up to get notifications through the listserv if you go to this website.
We didn't see any questions in the chat, and thank you so much, Dr. Spear and Dr. Murphy, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you again. It's really great for the Shore Resource Center. Hopefully, our faculty will start benefit from your center more in the future. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again for the invitation.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.